we just really want a sense of like kind of your life before social work, and then how you ended up as a social worker, and then your experiences in leadership.
Sure.
So whatever stories you want to tell, or the stories we want to hear.
Okay, all right.
Then maybe you can tell me a little bit about, your own beginnings, your family background, where you were born.
Sure,
that kind of stuff.
sure. Okay, so my family background is that my father was a Canadian soldier, fought in World War II. My mother was a war bride from England. So, but the problem with that was that they were supposed to get married in Europe, but Canada went off and invaded Italy and Sicily. And of course, they don't tell you they're going to go off and invade. So they didn't get married. And then my dad got shipped back to Canada because he'd been there for 5 years. And so they didn't get married, and because of that, my mother had no status to get to Canada. So it was many years later, after the war, she actually ended up in Canada, only to get to, she was from London, and her first comment on Canada was, on Toronto, it's a lot like Manchester, which I don't think was a positive thing. But anyways, so my mother got here, and her job when she got here, she found that her mother-in-law and her great-mother-in-law were both living in the same house, and they both needed palliative care. So that was how her marriage started. Anyways, I was born a few years later. I will say that a big part of my background is that both my parents were acutely suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. My mother, she just passed away a few years ago at 97. She would tell stories of the war without one word changing in the last 50 years. And if you hadn't heard them before, they were actually quite interesting. But of course, I'd heard them 500 times at that point. My dad, held a job Monday to Friday, and every weekend he drank heavily, and that's how he dealt with the war. And he would never talk about the war or anything like that. But I did hear a few stories. Like one time he was on leave in London, and a bomb dropped where he was, and he was with 2 other Canadian soldiers, and he was the only one to walk away. And he'd been in some pretty tough battles over things. Have you ever seen the movie Dunkirk? Well, he was there. So anyway, so the war, and I mentioned earlier my grandfather did the same thing, except he didn't come back. War has been a big part of our family history, primarily because it always put us in poverty. That was the social outcome of all of this, because, so I grew up in poverty. Wasn't aware as much when I was a kid that I was in poverty. It's only kind of retrospectively I look back on it. But, we had enough to eat, and my grandfather literally built the house we were in, literally. He didn't finish it before he went off, but that's another story. And so, we got through it, and, I guess as time wore on, and partly from influence of some teachers, both in high school and university, my politics became a thing for me. And, it was very much, I guess I became very much on the progressive side early, but not so early. I've gone that way since more, but at the time. But all of a sudden, politics was a thing, right? And politics was a thing, the way you could change some of these things. And of course, in 1968, Pierre Trudeau ran, and this was new. And John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson may have been fine people, but they're all in 3-piece suits and smoking cigars or whatever. And Trudeau's diving off diving boards and stuff. So politics really changed, and the first political act I did was I worked for the Liberal candidate in 1968, and actually one of the people I was working with on the campaign was Bob Rae. Now, I evolved not to be a Liberal, he evolved to going back to being a Liberal, but anyways. So politics was very important to me because I saw that as a way of changing, and I became more acutely aware of things that needed to be changed, social issues, the environment stuff and things like that. And I think my leftward shift started when I met Stephen Lewis, who at that time was the leader of the Ontario NDP, and he just captivated me. His oratorial skills, his way of taking a complex issue and boiling it down to, yeah, that's exactly what I think kind of thing, right? So then I shifted. I guess I was a Liberal for one election, and then I shifted to being a New Democrat, and I stayed as a New Democrat for quite a while, and then I got fed up with them too. So I became a non-partisan, and I later ran for city council, and one of the reasons was that's the only level you can run at and not be a member of a party, and I'm not a member of a party.
Can I just ask,
Sure.
In 1968, how old were you?
68, I would have been 12.
So you were doing political work at 12?
Yeah, that's right. No, 14. That's
14.
right, 54, yeah. Yeah, 14, that's right. Yes, I was doing political work at 54, yes. And yeah, so I was pretty young. And, it was just door knocking, putting up signs. There was, they didn't give me anything challenging to do, believe me. But, I felt that I was doing something. And it turned out the person who I was working for, his name was Charles Katcha, he got elected. And he was, if the NDP had had a chance, he would have been a New Democrat, but he wanted to get elected, so he was the Liberal candidate. And Charles was, that was a great first introduction to meet someone who, in my opinion, had a lot of integrity, and he ended up in the cabinet, in the Trudeau cabinet, environment, I believe. Yeah, so that's kind of where politics played in, and of course, social work to me is very political. It's all political. I think that if you don't have a political orientation to how you do social work, you're not doing it right. That's simple. Because I think when you look at the policies and all that, they influence the people that you're seeing, the people that you're trying to help, and all that kind of thing. And I just can't see how you can divorce yourself from the two, because the social problems are largely man-made or person-made. They're not divine intervention, and there's always alternatives, right? I mean, my thesis is about healthcare, and we often talk about healthcare, and they say, well, there's no choice, we have no money, well, all that kind of stuff. But there are a lot of choices, and one of the big myths is that our healthcare system costs so much money. That is a huge myth. If you look at what we spend and what other countries spend, it is well within the range. And if you look at historically what we spend as a percent of GDP, it hasn't changed much at all. And to say we don't have options, well, of course we have options. There are different healthcare systems around the world, and some of the ones in Western Europe spend far less and do far better. The difference, of course, is that we have a neoliberal healthcare system which looks at only the individual. So the individual is sick, we're going to treat the individual. So if 20 people on your street all had the same illness, no, we're going to treat each one individually. Well, how about looking at, maybe there's a cause there where all 20 people became sick. So it's looking at healthcare in a broader sense, and certainly the countries who have the best healthcare systems are the countries where the ratio of money spent on healthcare and the ratio spent on housing and social services is the narrowest. We have a huge discrepancy between, those two, right? What we spend on health and what we spend on other social things. It's huge. In Europe, it might be more like this. Still a little bit more on healthcare, but the investment is in housing, the investment is in social supports, in childcare, those kinds of things. And so it's no secret why they have better health outcomes than we have. But we look at the US and we say, ooh, we're better than that. And yes, we are. I don't think there's any question. The American healthcare system really sucks unless you have money. If you have money, it is the best system in the world. I mean, I had a personal experience there where my son was in the Cleveland Clinic, and we had money in the sense it was being covered by OHIP. And I saw that, I said, wow, what a system.
Yeah.
But,
so I'm going to take you just back, because
Sure.
we're going to get there. I know we are.
Sure.
But so you started when you were about 12, so that's kind of like the end of elementary school.
Yeah.
Like, maybe high school might not be relevant, but like where did you study social work? Did you study social work, or did you come back to social work?
Yes, I did.
What did you do in terms of your post-secondary?
Well, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. It was a choice between journalism and social work. I opted for journalism, so I went to Ryerson, now TMU, and I graduated from Ryerson with a degree in journalism, and then I went to work in St. John, New Brunswick, and because you couldn't get a job in Toronto with no experience. It was tough getting a job. I remember I had an interview I called up, there was a job opening in the Peterborough Examiner newspaper, so I called the guy up and I said, I don't have any experience, I've just graduated. He said, hey, no problem, just come on up, I'll have an interview. So I drove up to Peterborough, and he looked at my CV and he said, you don't have any experience. So there were a few cases like that. And so I worked in the media, I worked in St. John, I worked in London, Ontario, and for a while. And then I just really decided that, full disclosure, unless you work in a major market like Toronto, if you're working in London, working conditions really, really suck, and pay really sucks. So I tried to start a union where I worked, and I got fired. And then I said, well, I don't want to do this anymore. So I went to York University and got a BSW in social work. And I got my first job in social work, I guess you'd call starting at the bottom, as a welfare worker.
Okay, so can I just take you back?
Sure.
Can you tell us a little tiny bit about like York? Like, what years did you go to York? Who was there? What was that like? Because York's like a pretty like radical. Was
Yeah,
really
yeah,
radical school
yeah,
once upon a
absolutely.
time.
Yeah, it was then too, and that was just great. Brigida Kitchen was one of my profs, Saul Joel, um, Dorothy and Ed Herberg. Yeah, I don't know if these names mean anything to anybody, but yeah. And it was a very progressive school, and it really felt, wow, this is where I should be, kind of thing, right? So what years would they be?
What was the year you graduated, if you remember? Your class,
Yeah, it was kind of like late 80s, I think, something like that. Yeah. So yeah, so I graduated and decided I'd never go back to school again because at this point I'd been 2 degrees, and that was more than enough. But that changed later. So yeah, going to social work, especially at York at that time, was great. It really was about systemic issues. It was really about an anti-neoliberal bend to it. Well, we didn't. I don't know if we called it neoliberal back then. I don't think we did. I think we were kind of aware something was happening, but not too sure, right? So.
any placements?
Yes, I did my placement my placement was with Richard Johnson. He was the MPP and the social service critic for the NDP at the time. So yeah, so he gave me a lot of freedom to work on poverty issues, and we did some policy papers for him and that kind of stuff. So that was a fabulous experience, and Richard was great. And I think he became the president of Centennial College later, I'm not sure. And so yeah, that was a great experience. I spent some time working at the legislature and the caucus office and things like that. So got a whole, I was really, I was Mr. NDP at that point, right? Because it really fit. And Richard was very much, well, I remember when I was at the leadership convention and elected Bob Ray leader, and it was between Richard and Bob Ray, right? And I kept telling people, Bob Ray's a liberal. And they kept saying, but we can win with him, right? And that was kind of disappointing. And Richard came second, and he lost, and that kind of thing. But yeah, and I turned out to be correct, right? Because I knew Bob Ray a little bit from before, but yeah, and he did turn out to be a liberal. So there you go. Sometimes you get it right,
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you finished up at York and you became a welfare worker.
Yes.
Social assistance worker.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Tell us about that.
That was interesting. I started there, and I had 1 day of training, and the next day I had 110 clients. And at 2 o'clock, they'd all start phoning me saying, "Where's my check?" And I had no idea where their check was or why they weren't getting assistance, right? So, of course, my answer always would be, "Well, why do you think you didn't get your check?" And they would say, "Well, I didn't fill out the blah, blah, blah form." I said, "Well, fill out the form." I didn't know what that was either, right? So there was absolutely no training. You spent so many hours, because you weren't trained, all the new staff were there, you're supposed to finish at 4:30. We're all there till 6 because we didn't know how to do anything quickly or didn't know all the procedures and all that. It was just a terrible way of treating people. And, but, I always was trying to, feel like I was trying to help people. I don't know how much as a welfare worker you can. I remember very clearly we were told not to tell anybody where the food banks were, because if we told them about food banks, it would imply that what we're giving them on social assistance wasn't adequate. And we couldn't admit that what we were giving them wasn't good enough, so we couldn't tell them. Now, of course, we did. But that was the official line from the city, that you cannot tell people where and you're actually denying someone, you're stopping a worker from giving assistance to a person, and what is more important than food? I mean, really. So anyways, so then I guess I just I went through the city system, and I got promoted a few times. One time I was running the training program for new welfare visitors, ironically. And so, that was okay. And then I became a community development officer with the City of Toronto. So I had a number of projects in Etobicoke, that's where I was working, including one called the Stonegate Community Health Center. And so that we started, and the only reason we started a community health center was because I went searching for government funding, and we needed capital funding because we didn't have a building. And the only program I could see at the time that provided capital funding was the community health center program. Okay, we're getting a community health center. And that's how much thought went into it, right? It was, I'll go back a little bit, one story, just to show you how government was different. When I was in grade 12, a bunch of us decided we were going to have a hockey team. But because we lived rather in a poor area, we didn't have money for fees, we didn't have money for equipment, anything like that. So Wintario came out, which is the Ontario Lottery, the first one, right? And it was for amateur sports. So I sent a letter to Robert Welsh, who was the minister at the time, saying we have this hockey team and we need some money. So about 3 weeks later, I get this honking big check from the government of Ontario, way more than anything I'd ever seen. We're sending it to a grade 12 student who didn't even have a bank account at that point. And there was, I didn't have to do, all I had to do was send back the receipts of what I bought with it. Now, that wouldn't happen today. They'd want to know what my risk management policy is. They'd want to know, my incorporation number. Well, I was a grade 12 student. I barely had a SIN card, but it worked, None
So
of,
you bought the equipment and.
bought the equipment and we won the championship. It took us 3 years, but we won the championship in year 3. There you go, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's an example, I think, of how it changed. I'm not saying we need to go as slack as it was then, but nonetheless, the point was, I was asking for something that the government supported, amateur sports, kids being active, and they found a way to send me a check, and we did. Today, that would never happen, because that's not really the total intent, and I'll go into that later, but, so it just shows you how government has changed, really, in terms of social services and things like that, right? And so then I became I was a community development officer. One of the projects I was working on was Stonegate at Community Health Center. And they hired an executive director, and then they found out that he faked his resume. So they got rid of him, and they asked me if I would take the position, and which I did. So I was at Stonegate for 10 years, and then I went to Lamp Community Health Center for 17 after that.
So LAMP, what does
Yes.
LAMP stand for?
Lakeshore Area Multi-Services Project. It has nothing to do with lighting or anything like that.
Okay.
And Lakeshore Area, nobody calls it that, but considering the options, lump, they want an acronym, so yeah.
And so this is a part of Etobicoke that's in the
South End. Yeah. Stonegate is 72 low-rise apartments. You would never know where it is unless you knew where it was, kind of thing, because it's really literally, you go down this road and all of a sudden you see all these apartment buildings. And there's absolutely no services at all of any kind there. So, and because of the economics, it was a very high needs community with no services. And so that's kind of how it all started. So, and that's it.
Okay. So LAMP got funded.
Well, LAMP was funded before me.
Okay.
So LAMP came in, I think, in the 1970s, and this would be the late 80s for Stonegate, I think. So LAMP was around. LAMP had been around. And it got better, but when LAMP started, you literally had to be a missionary to work there. I mean, the government was a project of the provincial government. Salaries, I think doctors were making about $30,000 a year. So hard to get staff. Staff literally would go to garage sales on the weekend, and that's how the place was furnished. In fact, when I came to LAMP in 1999, some of that garage door furniture was still around. And I said, guys, we're not that poor anymore like we used to be. We can have real chairs now. We don't have to, LAMP went through the tough times of community health centers. I think there were 10 community health centers. There was out a report. Dr. John Hastings from the U of T Medical School was asked by Premier Robarts to write a report on what he could do about healthcare, because population wasn't getting any healthier, and it was costing more and more money. Sounds very similar to today. So John Hastings wrote this report which advocated for community health centers, which of course was a wider mandate, run by community boards, all those who had real CHC boards have real authority. It's not like a what do they call it? It's not an advisory board. It's a real board. So it was a different model of care, and of course the OMA was adamant against it because CHC's doctors are on salary. They didn't support that at all. Fee for service is where it's at. And the OMA did pretty much everything to stop it. Actually, the first kind of CHC was in Sault Ste. Marie. And what happened was the mine workers in Sault Ste. Marie were paying into a private pension plan, I think it was Prudential. And the doctors in Sault Ste. Marie decided to opt out and actually charge above what the Prudential plan provided. So the union, the steelworkers union, decided with all the money we're spending in premiums to Prudential, we could use that money and hire our own health staff. So that's what they did. And, there was all kinds of stuff. They couldn't get a building permit for their facility because the city government was in bed with the OMA and every possible thing. And finally the hospital said, well, we're not accepting referrals from doctors who work at what was called the community, what was it called? I can't remember. But anyways, wherever came from the CHC, we're not accepting those people, right? And it was tough on the doctors because they wanted to be accepted by their peer group, but their peer group was telling them, what the hell are you doing getting paid a salary? So the hospital stopped referrals from the CHC, and what happened was the Steelworkers Union then went to court against the hospital, saying you can't do this, these are licensed doctors like everybody else. And the Ministry of Health stepped in and said, you got to take them. And that was a landmark thing. And then a few years later, more and more expansion and up and down. When Frank Miller was the premier, one of the first things in his budget was to can all the community health centers. It turned out this is how policy is made. Dennis Chimbrell was the Ministry of Health, and his wife was on the board of South Riverdale Community Health Center. She convinced Dennis Chimbrell to fight for community health centers, and he did. Frank Miller backed down, and we survived. Even though we were back to starvation wages for a while, we survived. And that, when I remember when Mike Harris got elected, and everybody's kind of, I said, our goal here is to be standing when he's not. When he's gone, we're still going to be here, and that's the way we approached it. But surprisingly enough, Mike Harris, he had a child that needed speech and language, so he cut a lot of things. But one thing he did was he massively increased the funding for speech and language for kids. So we got a speech and language program. So sometimes.
Yeah.
You take the opportunities that are given, right?
Even a stop clock tells the right time twice a day.
That's right, exactly, yes.
Um,
And welfare, we had a food bank at LAMP, and I can't say exactly, but I think when Harris cut welfare rates by 22%, I think our food bank usage went up about 500%, because it was a choice. Pay the rent or feed your family, right? So people were spending less money paying the rent and then coming to LAMP for food services.
So I just want to make sure, because I think I may have missed something. So you were a community development worker working for the City of Toronto?
Metro Toronto at the time, yeah.
Toronto, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
So it was the regional government,
Yes,
the Metro.
Yeah.
So you worked to get funding for the
Stonegate.
Stonegate.
Yep.
And then from there, you transitioned into your role at LAMP?
No.
No.
From there, after they fired the ED for falsifying his background,
Okay.
they hired me, and I stayed there for, I think, 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was great, because you're talking about literally building a building, and which I knew nothing about construction, but I learned a lot. And hiring all the staff and developing all the programs. Everything was from square one. It was a lot of fun, and it was really felt like you're really doing something, because we really were making a difference in a community that had no services at all. So that was a great time.
Right. So sorry, I'm still maybe
It's okay.
may just be a detail that I'm missing.
Sure.
So LAMP existed before, but then
Yes.
expanded into Stonehaven.
No, the Stonegate and LAMP are two separate, right?
Two separate.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Then you transitioned into LAMP.
I transitioned to LAMP, and when I got to LAMP, we had a budget of about $2 million. And I guess when I left there 17 years later, we had a budget of close to 13.
Okay. So sorry again. I'm probably missing a detail. So you worked at Stonehaven for 10 years.
Stonegate for 10 years, yes.
And then you
Moved to LAMP, yes.
When LAMP's ED
Retired.
retired.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just got
Yeah. Yeah, and I was there for 17 years,
Okay.
and it was great except for the last few years when governments brought in the LINs and all that stuff.
Right.
And I felt that I was spending most of my time working for the LINs, sending out reports, coming up with data, all this stuff that Well, the provincial auditor later did a report that said nobody in the ministry actually ever looked at any of these stuff. And I'm sure that, I wouldn't be surprised that's still not the case. So we would spend all this time, and expense getting data, getting hardware, computers, software, all that kind of stuff that never really worked properly, because what a CHC records and what a private physician in their own practice records are very different. But that's what we're given. We're given this template, this medical version. So all the health promotion activities, well, we can't, how are we going to put this into the data system? So it was a grossly inadequate system. And you know, it just, you could, I don't know when the neoliberal healthcare system started. I certainly Kathleen Wynne had a big role in it, for sure. I don't know how much she was aware of what she was doing, but I think what happens is in government is that the government has a problem, like in healthcare, right? So what the government has to do is come up with a solution and then be seen to be actually implementing something. So it looks like they're not ignoring the issue, they're actually doing something, right? So when the Liberals came in with Kathleen Wynne, I'm sure they were a party that needed a policy real quick. And the bureaucrats said, we've got this idea, we're going to regionalize healthcare. And George Smither was the Minister of Health. He described it as local communities would now have a say over the healthcare in their community. I mean, he had the right vision. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. The senior bureaucrats at Queen's Park did not let the LHINs do anything without their approval, and every LHIN was treated the same. So there was absolutely no local context to the LHINs at all. And somehow, and of course then Doug Ford said he's going to get rid of the LHINs, and then he just brought in something else called Ontario Health. Same idea. What they're doing is they're taking a structure, a decentralized structure, and they're putting it, but they're using it to run the plant centrally. That's what they're doing, under the idea that it's decentralized, but it's not, because everybody does the same thing. Every strategic plan from all 14 LHINs were basically the same. So you mean to tell me the strategic plan for healthcare in Toronto was the same as Moosonee? You know, but by and large, the plans were the same, right? All about integration, right? And you know, what my research tells me is that we are one of the most integrated systems in the world, right? But they say integrate, oh yeah, we got to be more. And what's the opposite of that? Well, no, we want to be disintegrated, right? You know.
So maybe I'll just take you back again, if you don't mind, because part of the point of the project is to talk about leadership,
right? And
to understand some of the ways in which folks in social work do leadership differently. So maybe I can just take you back to the Stonehaven days. Stonegate, sorry. Oh,
Stonehaven sounds better though, actually.
Sorry. Stonegate.
Yes.
So Stonegate, you get hired, you're doing everything, it sounds like, including building a building.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about like what was that leadership like in those times, and what were some of the maybe like exciting victories or opportunities that you were able to really kind of manifest in your role as the leader? As I said, it was a great time. So before we had a building, I had an office in the basement of a beauty parlor in the Stonegate Plaza, and there was no heat, and Fridays were perm days. The whole place just stank of perm. It was terrible. It was just my mother came down one day to see it. Oh, you left the city for this, did you? You know, but you have to have a vision, right? You have to, I guess the leadership was getting people on side that this is going to be really good, and this is what it's going to be. And what it's going to be is what you say it's going to be. So we had workshops throughout the community saying, okay, what kind of services do you want? And people were, to be honest, people were very traditional, you know, doctors on OHIP kind of model, right? But you know, but the role was to push them on that. Well, what about this problem? What about this problem? What about the fact that there's no child care programs here? Maybe we could have a child care, parent-child kind of thing in the center. So it was a way of facilitating a lot of ideas, and that's what came out. We did have a senior center, we did have a parent-child center, and these are things that were funded by the Ministry of Health that would not be funded today. They would say, you want a child care center, go over to the ministry that does that. But the idea of a CHC is that it's multidisciplinary. Those kind of barriers between, well, this is not part of our ministry, this is that. The early days of CHCs, that's not the case now, but the early days, that didn't matter. Nobody cared about that stuff.
because we had a very small branch of the ministry that had absolutely no power, but they were on our side, and they were, and so we could do things that were well out what most people would say would be well out what, what does a literacy program have to do with health? That was one of the first questions somebody asked me one day, right?
What's the answer?
Well, a literacy program is something that enables you to participate in society, enables you to get a job, and enables you to, to actually accomplish things in life. And so yeah, that's basically how I see it. And what the literacy program did to people's self-esteem was amazing, just amazing. These people these are adults, it's not kids, these are adults in their 40s, 50s who could not read. And then a few months in our program, they were reading, they were writing poetry. I mean, you could just see the turnaround in the people. And they were smiling, they were, they really felt like they felt like the center was their place. And that was the whole idea, that it's a community place. There's no marble countertops. We're not, we want people to come in, right? And I remember I showed up one day and somebody says, there's somebody sleeping in the center. This guy, homeless guy, had slept there all night. Why the motion detectors didn't go off, I don't know. But anyways, I said, well, he's not doing any harm. He's just sleeping. And he obviously feels that this is a good place for him to sleep. So ignore him and we'll wake up and he'll leave, which is actually what happened. But that was the idea. This is a community place. This is a community place that has, I used to describe it, this is a community center with health services. And that's kind of what it was. And so it was a very different model, for sure. And that's probably where the ebbs and flows went with who was the political party, because I don't think the Conservatives were too into all the health promotion. They understood, they understood medical care, but they didn't understand the broad determinants of health. And that was what we did. We focused on the broad determinants as much as you can. I mean, there are limitations, obviously. But so I think getting the center was a big thing. That took many years. Many years of getting the center, getting it up and running, and getting it to be a place where people just felt they could drop in, have coffee, that kind of stuff. It was a community place, and that to me is what services should be about. Like we have parks and rec facilities all over the place. I don't think they're really a community service. People go in there for a service, but I don't think anybody would go in there and have coffee and sit and chat with the people who work there, right? It's a different vibe to it. And I think we really got that vibe. And we did some work, Rob Ford's first budget, which involved cuts to just about every service the city had. We were instrumental in defeating that budget. We got a ton of doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals to sign a petition to say this is a cut to healthcare. And I think I was on 680 News about, I don't know how many times, because we did it on a Sunday, figured nobody else was doing anything. So the news media was, all over it. So we got a lot of press. And I was told by a city councillor that Rob Ford had a 2-vote majority until we did that, and he lost by 2 votes. So we moved 4 people. And I would say that was probably the most significant thing we ever did. We stopped, other people too, but the CHCs took a particular role because they were able to argue from a health perspective. If we were arguing from a social services perspective, they say, oh, well, social services, who cares, right? But from a health perspective, you're harming children's health if you vote for this budget. That really resonated. And I think, well, councillors told me that we made the difference on that. So I put that down as my number one thing. Yeah.
And just to help us kind of mark like this time period, so Rob Ford was coming into power.
Yeah.
What were some of the other big social issues that were happening?
Well,
particular crises? Or?
Well, where I was at LAMP at this point. We have the affordable housing, which is mostly low rent for profit housing, right? We have some co-ops and all that, but most of it is commercial housing, and it's all in Lake Ontario. Now, it's very unusual to have the affordable housing on the prime real estate, but that's what we had. That's just how the place evolved. And of course, so developers said, ooh, yeah. And so they decided that they were going to knock them all over, and build condos, right? So we organized, I think, about 350 people into a tenants association, and we put pressure on the city. The councillor was all for the developers, always was, always will be. So no, didn't have to worry about. That didn't matter. And then eventually the developers came back with a plan that they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll build and we'll move all you people to another location. Shitty land by the railroad tracks, out of the community. So the kids would still have to leave the school they'd gone to for all these years and all that kind of stuff. And we fought that, and city staff supported us. We had many meetings with the planners on the QT and talked about, all this kind of stuff, and they were very supportive. So by city bylaw, they would have to replace, if they take an affordable unit out, you have to build one. But they were not building it in a desirable place. So our point, well, if you're building it, it has to be on site. You can build your luxury, but you have to keep or rebuild the affordable units in the same place as the luxury. Well, no developer wanted that. Wouldn't make money doing that. So eventually the developers left because we had saved, 400 or 500 units of housing. So that was a big issue at the time, for sure. Other ones back in time. I'm not too sure. I don't think anything that's all that different today. I mean, welfare rates were pathetic, and one of the things too, of course, was that engagement of low-income people was really not good. If you looked at the election results for the city in South Etobicoke, the participation rate was 51%. But if you looked at the co-ops and the nonprofit, it was around 30%, right? So later, I ran for council, and I said, I'm going to work the nonprofit housing and the low-income housing. That's where I'm going to be canvassing. And so many people told me, you're nuts, because they're not going to vote. And I said, well, it's because they never had a reason to vote. We're going to give them a reason. And what happened at the end of the election, which I lost, but I carried every poll in the affordable co-op housing. And the voter rate went up to 55%, higher than the overall average for the ward. Because we gave them a reason. We said, we're going to protect your housing. We're going to do those kinds of things. So, they felt under threat. And it just shows you, it just shows you. And by the end, even the councillor actually did a drop of a flyer in these buildings, which he'd never done before in the 15 years he'd been the councillor. And that's what I got at the door so many times. Nobody ever come knocking on our door. You're the first one running for office who's ever come here. Okay, well then vote for me. and they did.
Great. Okay, so again, I'm just going to take you back a tiny little bit, because you kind of
I know.
moving into your electoral stuff. So working at Stonegate and then working at Lamb.
Yep.
It sounds like part of your role was helping the community kind of raise their own issues and then responding to those issues.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the skills.
Sure.
And the abilities and the things that you needed to know or needed to learn in order to be successful at that kind of leadership practice. Yeah,
I mean, I looked at my job as it was like two things. I had all the administrative stuff, which I had to do, but I always carved out a part of my job to actually work in the community, because that's what I wanted to do, right? And as I said, one of the reasons I left at the end is I didn't have time to do that anymore because of all the administrative stuff coming from the government. So, well, I think you got to be willing to listen to people. Your idea that, they live in this community, that alone gives them a certain level of credibility as to what they think should be in the community. I think you got to realize it's not a short-term fix, and it's not easy, because communities are not like this idea that they all have the same idea, this is what should happen. That's so far from the truth. There are various different political views out there in the community, as there are everywhere else. So there's rarely unanimity. So, and there's different communities. There's a business community, there's a business association, they all have different things, right? So a big part of the job, I thought, was, okay, where can we have some commonality here on the things that matter to both of us? If it doesn't matter to one group, well, we can go off on our own and do that, right? But there are some things that matter to both, and how do we work out something that can at least please most people? And a large part of that, I think, is people just don't understand what others are going through. They don't understand, well, maybe they do now, but they didn't understand affordable housing and its impact on people's lives. They didn't understand, how some of these, well, they didn't understand, one of them, carding, right? I was involved in a carding campaign, and we...
Did you define carding?
Oh, yes, carding, well, okay. The unofficial line is that if you're a black male, probably in your teens or early 20s, a police officer will come up to you and say, where have you been, who are your friends, blah, 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 all that, to create this data setup around all these people. They had no reason to stop these people, but they kept asking them questions, right? And one of my staff, he was black, he got stopped like 3 times in one day, right? And then that was followed by an incident. We ran a basketball program at a local school, and the program went till 9 o'clock. Well, at 9 o'clock, the cop cars were outside the gym, and when the kids walked out, they all had to lay face down on the ground where they were searched. And I said, that's ridiculous. I almost said, and so I said to the guy, our staff person, I said, well, you got to file a complaint here. And he said, I'm not filing a complaint, because he also lived in the community. I said, okay, I will. So I filed a complaint, and the complaint process, you didn't actually have to see it. You just had to be aware of it, right? So about a month later, I get a call from a cop who says, well, we got your complaint here, but you didn't actually see it, did you? I said, no, but your rules say you don't have to. Oh, no. You have no credibility here. You didn't see it, so we're dismissing this. So I called a deputy chief. Oh, I can't remember his last name. Anyways, he was deputy chief, and he was black. And I said, okay, this is what happened, right? And without me telling him, he identified the police officer that did it. And I said, how do you know this? And he says, well, we know about this guy, right? So what happened was, about a week later, he was in another precinct. That really doesn't solve the problem, because he came to the lakeshore from another precinct, probably for similar activities. But that's what happened. And, when I talked to the youth, all of them had experiences with the police that would just make your mouth drop. I'd go away and say, oh, I can't believe this is the way black youth, well, I could believe, but the way black youth were engaged or being treated by the police was just ridiculous. So, we organized an anti-carding campaign. One of my ideas that nobody agreed to was to go down to Bay Street outside the stock exchange and card people as they were coming out of the stock exchange and ask them who their friends were, where they were going, all that kind of stuff. But anyways, people didn't want to do that. I think you have to have fun sometimes in doing these things, right? And so, we really politicized, I think, the black community. And one of those black people just got elected to city council in the last election. Amber Morley is the councillor in South Etobicoke now. She was one of the youth who was engaged in all this work back in those days. So, that's a victory, right? And Amber grew up in subsidized housing and all that kind of stuff. So she was, an example of who we're trying to work with, right? And so that was good, having someone graduate from LAMP and become a city councillor. Right.
The approach in terms of working at LAMP, that in the early days, there was more of an emphasis on responding to the community, and then we kind of transition into the more neoliberal kind of reality. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the timing on that, when you started to notice a difference. Yeah,
I mean, one of the big differences is when we would submit a budget request to the ministry every year, and we could put in things that we wanted, and we would rank them. And sometimes you would get, and sometimes you wouldn't, but a lot of times you did get something. So you'd make the argument that this is a needed service in our community, these are the reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And, if they had the resources, pretty sure you would get that funded. So what happened when 2005, when the LHINs first started, that was gone. In fact, the whole community health branch was gone, wiped out. And what happened now, and what still happens, is that the government will put out an RFP, we are doing a program about X. And they would send out the RFP, and if you want to apply, there you go. So basically what's happened is, how is the need defined? Well, in the former case, it was defined by the community need, right? It's what we saw in the community, it's what the board said, you know, that we should do this, that kind of thing. But it moved from that to what the ministry now wanted. And that is a significant difference. So we had programs at the end that I would say were not, in any stretch of the imagination, our priorities, but they weren't offensive. Sure, you know, like
Give an example.
diabetes. Lamb still has the largest non-hospital diabetes program in the province, and until that funding came, and this was during the Harris era, and until that funding came out, diabetes is a problem in the Lakeshore, but it's a problem everywhere. It was never something we said we got to do something about, right? But of course, with all the cuts that Harris had made, well, this was a rich program. So all of a sudden, diabetes is us. So we became a diabetes, so we pushed hard and got the funding for that. And that funding, of course, talking about school now, subsidized other programs. Because what we did was, we charged the diabetes program rent for our own facility, and then used that money to fund a youth program or something like that. And so we did have a good diabetes program. I'm not taking it away. I'm just saying that would not have been a priority had the old system still been in effect when the center actually decides and goes to the ministry and said, this is what we need. So that was a difference, and I think that's still the case today. So now you're having a centralized body for all of Ontario, basically deciding what each part of the province should have. And usually it's the same. We're going to have a province-wide program for this, so everybody does it. So that's a big difference. And
So sorry, if I could just stop for 1 second.
Sure.
So diabetes are us.
Yes.
And there's funding for diabetes programs.
Yes.
You figure out how to make diabetes programs resource other things. How do you figure that out?
well,
That's a skill.
yeah, I mean, they might use the same computer as another program might use the same computer. They might use their office at different times, and all that would be funded by the diabetes program. But you can't stop somebody going in there on Tuesday afternoons if there's nobody there and working there and things like that. Or we would charge them for reception support, and that reception support it was, there was all kinds of pockets and moving money and stuff like that. And I guess, some people will say, well, that's not really right. But what's the goal here? To me, the goal was to make the money go as far as we can to provide the services this community needs. And if this means kind of shading a bit on whatever, well, we're going to try that. And we were audited and all that kind of stuff. It's not like anybody absconded money or anybody got wealthy on the money. It was a question of trying to provide some support for programs that otherwise don't get support. Youth programs are a good example. Really hard to get funding for teenagers. Really hard, right? So, we had donations of space. We did whatever we could. Fundraising would go to that program, whatever. We did what we could, because the youth obviously was an issue in our community, and we needed, and we had all these youth who were using our services. Okay, well, if the funding gets cut, we just can't let them go. We've got to find other ways. And being creative on fundraising and doing fundraising became a bigger part of my job. It wasn't a part that I particularly liked, but it became necessary. So, I would go to the Rotary Club and make a speech at lunch, and then we'd get a check and, that kind of stuff, right? And we'd hold fundraisers, but fundraisers really, holding a fundraiser in a low-income community doesn't usually generate much. But it is a way of bringing people together and having some kind of a community event and things like that. So it wasn't a total loss, but we really didn't do it for money because, we wouldn't make that much, but it was just another way of involving the community. So, and I guess also the more directives from the ministry about this and that and this and, need this, accreditation, you need a policy on this, you need a policy on that, all that kind of things, I remember at one time we failed accreditation because we didn't have a research policy. And I said, yeah, but we don't do any research. But you might someday, but we don't do it now. But you still need a policy, right? So then I went to their website. They had a copy. I took it. I put my letter on it, sent it back to them and said, there's my policy. I don't think anybody in LAMP knew we had a research policy other than me who wrote it up that minute. But the silliness of so-called accountability, right? All these measures that we would have to put out, which were really fundamentally very meaningless because, they looked at what they called was efficiency. So if you had a doctor, for example, who saw 10 people an hour, and another doctor who saw 5 people an hour, was that first doctor twice as efficient as the first one? Well, what kind of care did they get? How effective were those 2 doctors? What were the issues that the patient was coming with? But anyways, that's the kind of questions that were never part of the ministry data. It would just be, well, this doctor saw 5 and this doctor saw 10, so why is that? That was the level of it, right? So we spent a lot of time producing useless data, but pretending. I would go to these meetings of all the executive directors and the ministry would be there, and we would talk about data. Usually they would shame us. They'd put our results on the wall, so one center would be up, the other one would be down, and all that kind of stuff. And, but we all acted like it was real, except when we were in the hallway after, oh, that'll pile of bullshit, right? But in the meeting, we'd all, oh, yeah, for sure, ministry, we'll do that. But, the government was so out of touch, or the ministry is so out of touch between the actual things we're doing, or at least they were having to be that way from what was being enforced by their political masters. I don't know where it went. But, they just don't know what community health centers are. And they think they're just like a regular medical practice. They really do. And therefore, that's what they fund. When you look at whatever new funding, which has been very small, that has gone to CHCs since 2005, since the Lynn. Actually, you'll find this in my thesis. The budgets for CHCs have all gone down significantly every year if you factor in inflation. There has never been a year since 2005 when CHCs have got an increase at the level of inflation. Most of the times it's been a 0 increase. This year, with inflation, at 6-7%, CHCs have been promised a 2% raise, which is the biggest raise they've had. But it's still a 4%, if inflation's 6%, it's still a 4% cut. That doesn't, if you look at the budget, which you will, the money for hospitals has stayed at inflation and sometimes exceeded it. But for community health centers, every year has been a financial cut since 2005 in real dollars. And, and there was no response to that. Absolutely no response, right? And because, the Ontario Health is out to end CHCs because what they have is what they call these Ontario Health Teams, which are localized groups of providers in one area. And the plan is that one of those organizations, and there has to be a hospital in every OHT, one of those organizations is going to assume the budget for all of the organizations. So everybody who gets funded by the Ministry of Health in this geographic area is going to get their money funneled to one organization that is going to manage the data and is going to manage the finances. Well, there is only one organization capable of doing the budget for all those organizations, and that's the hospital, right? So what will happen is that CHCs will always be around. I don't think they're going to go, but they will become affiliates of the hospitals. And what happened in Quebec and what happened in Australia, we are replicating the same things that have been done and failed everywhere else. So what happened in all those cases, health promotion pretty much died because the government wasn't interested, the hospital wasn't interested in health promotion. We got a deficit over here in ICU. We got to fund that. That's more important than your health promotion. So that's what's happened everywhere else. I don't see why Ontario is going to be different. And that's the road that we have been going down. We've been going down this idea that health is an individual problem that needs to be solved. It has nothing to do with community. And yet most of the reasons why people are sick are social determinants. I mean, I remember who quoted, somebody said about 66% of the illness could be addressed if we address social determinants. I mean, even basic stuff, in Germany, you go to the schools in Germany, they actually give their kids quality food at lunchtime. I mean, what a thought. We give them French fries and hamburgers, right? So, yeah, It's been the death of health promotion. So we've held on to what we had prior to 2005, but there's been nothing since.
So it sounds like at some point in your journey, you decided to run for city council.
Yes.
And so can you tell me a little bit about that, like the decision to do that? Why did you do that? How did you do that? And how do you see, or is it in any way linked to your social work identity?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so I decided to run in 2014 after going around trying to find somebody to run against the incumbent councillor, who, I won't disparage him on tape because I could get sued, but let's just say was not interested in any social issues, okay? And I couldn't find anybody who would run, or if they wanted to run, I thought could beat this guy. So, as my daughter said to me, he said, "Dad, you've always said to us in these situations, you got to step up and do it." So my daughter says, "Dad, you got to step up." So, okay, on that basis, I ran for council. And so yes, I think the process of running for council, and I think what I was talking about, right? I was talking about childcare, I was talking about housing, I was talking about carding, I was talking about, I say childcare, no jets on the on the island, you know. So the agenda was a very progressive agenda for sure, and so that kind of reflects it. And you know, our process for a team, we tried to run it as a team, you know, have as many volunteers and all that out there, and so we had a structure which we didn't really work, because bottom line is, in a campaign, you need somebody in charge to make decisions. That became obvious after a while. And so I had a campaign manager, and he said, you know, this is how it's going to be done, man, because, you know, he was well experienced. So we lost a little bit of that. But, you know, what the campaign was about, you know, it was about the agenda that me and others had put forward. We weren't reacting to John Tory and his, what did he call it, smart track. You know, we had a transit plan, but his transit plan was totally fake, because he was going to fund it through the development of condominiums and office towers that were going to be coming once the new subway lines were put in. Well, that's a wish and a prayer, right? We might get funding from these new stations because people will develop around them. Well, how many years is that going to take, right? So that was John Tory's smart track, and it was just ridiculous. So, you know, we focus on local needs, because in Mimico there's so many condos were developed and no transit facilities to speak of. So we focused on solutions there. And Olivia Chow was running for mayor, and we kind of helped each other out. You know, I dropped some of her literature, and her volunteers did some of my literature, and at least I think they did. I said that. And we had support. You know, I had support from the Labour Council. I had support. With the exception of the Toronto Sun, I was endorsed by every newspaper other than the Toronto Sun. And I said to Ruth Greer once, when she was endorsed by the Toronto Sun, I said, I don't know if I can work for a candidate who's been endorsed by the Toronto Sun. So, yeah. So I didn't mind not having that endorsement. So, yeah, I think we fought the issues on the issues that were important to us. And again, as I said earlier, the process was I was going to engage with people who didn't normally vote, who were low income. You know, I didn't follow the path of going to the more expensive parts of the war, and there are on the lakefront. There's Palace Pier and all that. Well, I did canvass Palace Pier. You know, there are those areas, and you can look at from the previous election and see the vote totals. But okay, they're going to vote, but these people aren't. And if they do vote, there's a good chance they're going to vote the Ford ticket, Doug and me, right? So, yeah. So we focused on, even though people, Ruth Greer being one of them, said, this isn't going to work. You cannot focus your time trying to get low-income people to vote, because they won't. Well, we didn't do that. We did focus our time. And as I said earlier, we won every poll, and we increased the percentage to 55, which was higher than the ward-wise. So maybe it cost the election. I don't know. I lost by a few hundred. It wasn't a big loss. But I felt good about the way we did the process. I got over 10,000 votes, so it still was close. It was close.
So tell me about running for municipal government as a social worker. Like, is
Yeah.
there overlap? Do you feel you have skills specific to social work that helped you do that kind of work? Like, is there a relationship?
Well, certainly knowledge. I mean, you certainly gain knowledge of the issues that are affecting people by being a social worker. There's no question. I think you also, in terms of skills, you learn how to relate to people in a way, right? I mean, I think the worst thing you can do as a social worker and as someone in public office is just saying, well, I know what's right. You know, and when you take that position, you invariably end up into a power struggle with another person. So both of you aren't listening, and you both have your different opinions. And I think the worst thing you can do in social work is get into a power struggle with somebody, because that's not really helpful. So you have to have the level of humility to at least see the other side of the person, accept the fact that, you know, whether you agree with them or not, it is their perspective. It's how they see the world, and you can't deny how somebody else sees the world. So that's all I think we learn in social work. And I think that helps as a candidate, because it makes it easier to relate to people. And I think if you're elected, yeah, I mean, I think there should be more social workers. There were actually 3 of us in Ontario, executive directors, who ran, and we all lost. But we all came close. You know, because, you know, I mean, you know, I'm sure the business community in the Lakeshore did not vote for me.
I'm sorry.
I'm sure the business community in the Lakeshore did not vote for me, even though I had good relations with them and all that. It wasn't my agenda, guys. That's just not where I'm coming from, right? So you just accept that, right? That's not going to be where you're going from. But so yeah, I think the skills in social work are very important to running a campaign. I think the knowledge is important to running a campaign, and I think the fire should come from being a social worker. You know, look at the way people are living. Look at the way people can't get to work in the morning. Whatever the problem is, you have an obligation as a social worker to try somehow to link those things together and get people involved in community work. So to me, running for office was just an exercise in community work. It really was. I mean, the similarities, other than the fact that you don't, as a community worker, you don't have to knock on doors from 9 till 9 for like 40 days in a row, which is what I did. Yeah. Oh yeah. I knocked on every door, most of them even twice. Yeah. Oh, yes, my body was wrecked by the end of it. My back was hurting, my legs were hurting. I ended up having to get knees replaced afterwards. Yeah. Not just because of that, but yeah.
It added to it.
Yes, it added to it.
So if you look back on your career as somebody who's retired now, what would you say were some of the greatest achievements that you've had, and how did you do that?
Well, that's the thing, right? It's the thing is about community work is you have to understand that you're there for the long haul. Because when let's say you're dealing with somebody at the political level, at city council or with staff or whatever, they're going to do their utmost to put you off. And they're going to assume you're not coming back. But if you come back and you come back and you come back and you keep on that issue, eventually, I don't know if they get tired of you or they see your point, whatever, eventually you do see some change. And I talked earlier about the tennis association. I think that was the case. We actually went back to the planners many times, talked about the issues, talked about why relocating these people other places. And they became, over time, totally on side with us. And they wrote a report for the city council, which was we could have written it. I mean, it was amazing when I read it. It was great. And I think that's how you do it, right? That's how you kind of do politics. But the thing is, you can't give up. You've got to stay in the fight, because the fight is there to stop you from staying there, right? And you don't have the resources that we didn't have the resources developers had. They could put on a big meeting and people would come and they'd give them free food and all that. We couldn't match that. But we had it at very much the grassroots level. So we talk a lot about the digital age and advocacy, people signing, how many times do we get petitions online? Oh, just sign this, right? And that's really low investment. Anybody can click and sign, but not everybody will go out on the street and do something like that, right? So I don't know how effective this online stuff is when a counselor gets all these online petitions. I don't think it has the same influence. So when I look back, I guess going back to your question, which I haven't answered, is some of the key things. Well, I think one of them obviously was the municipal election, Rob Ford's thing. That was significant. Keeping the housing in the Lakeshore, that was significant. I think despite all the odds, getting the health center at Stonegate, that took years. That was years of work that went into that. And keeping a community group engaged for years, because, Russ, is this ever going to happen? You know? And yeah. And finally, the Peterson government was actually the ones that announced it, but they didn't do anything. They just announced that Stonegate's getting a health center. Well, then Peterson loses the election. And then nothing happens for months before when a new government comes in, right? So we waited almost a year in that transition. But anyways, I think that was a key thing. And I think generally what the organization did was engage people. And I looked to the number of youth at LAMP particularly who made deputations at city council and committees and all that kind of stuff, and have credibility at council when they make those kinds of things, because they've learned, how to write a brief, what goes into a brief, and that they can do that stuff, which they couldn't do, and it's engaged them, and some of them were, high school students who weren't doing very well in high school. Well, all of a sudden now they've got a place, and a place that is treating them with respect. So I think those are some of the conversations. I don't know. It's hard to say, because the thing is, you don't know really what is your accomplishment, right? If you're working as part of a collective, if you're working with people, if you're working with an unseen bureaucracy, who knows what led to the decision? But all of a sudden the decision comes out that's very positive, right? And somebody did something somewhere, and maybe it was because of something you did, maybe not, who knows? I always tell the groups, hey, take credit. Why not? Right? You put hours into this, it's your victory, and we need to celebrate those victories. So yeah, I don't know.
So that sounds like a little piece of advice. Is there any other advice you would give to someone who is interested in leadership and social work?
Well, I think you have to understand that it's harder in many ways now than it was, in the sense that there's just so much more so-called accountability, reporting, all that. I mean, there were days I walked home and said, I could have been working in an insurance company today for all the impact I had on anybody's life, right? I was just processing paper, right? And so I think you really gotta really want it to put up with that, to put up with what the government is doing and the thing. And you also have to have a place to do the stuff that needs to be done. You really, and that's what I said when I left, because I felt that place was getting smaller and smaller just because of time. I just couldn't do as much because I had all this other nonsense to deal with. But you have to have that place. If you are a social worker, I don't care what your job title is, that is your job. To engage people who are not otherwise engaged, and to develop programs and services or advocacy initiatives or whatever that meets the needs of that population. That's what you do. You're a social worker, that's what you do. The government has made it much more harder to do that, particularly around advocacy, right? Because there's now laws in effect that say that the so-called Patients First Act, which had nothing to do with patients at all, the Patients First Act says that if, at the time, the LHIN, but now Ontario Health, if Ontario Health feels that you're not acting in the best interests of Ontario, they can fire the senior staff, dispense with the board, and put a trustee into any organization that receives $1 of ministry health funding. That is the most draconian piece of legislation I have ever, but it's called Patients First, so it must be good. Charles Starr wrote a great article on how great Patients First was. Have you read it? Patients First, by the way, was the name of Margaret Thatcher's legislation when she dismantled public health care. I don't know if anybody in Ontario knew that when they named theirs Patients First, but anyways. So, yeah, it's much harder today. I mean, I didn't know it at that time, but I think I was there for the good times, where you could actually speak out and not be in fear of anything or anything like that. And, I was tempering my thoughts near the end too, because you don't want to do something that's going to cause harm to the organization. You know, you have to be more careful at the end, right? And we were audited by the Harper government, one of those organizations. We were audited. I still remember it actually happened when I was running for council during the campaign. And when I got back, I had this big letter from, I can't remember what department it would be, probably Revenue Canada, that they'd done an audit. And they said, you know, there's a few things here and that, but by and large, we passed the audit. But of course, that's the last paragraph that you read. And this was pages of fine single-spaced type, right? And yeah, but I mean, the fact that a government like Harper would do something like that, because apparently we said something they didn't like, I guess, right? And I know another center, they had a anti-racism and an equity policy, and Jason Kenney saw it, and he didn't think that was what Canada was all about. So he was threatening an audit of that center too. So, you know, we think we live in a free society. Not really. And it's you know, in healthcare, I mean, the three major parties are the OMA, the senior bureaucrats, and the government. That's it, right? And those three share power. You know, the government cannot tell a doctor to do anything. That's under the Canada Health Act. The conditions of their employment have to be negotiated with the OMA. So you can't tell a doctor he has to go practice up north where there are no doctors. You can't do that, right? You can't tell a doctor he has to use an electronic record system. You can't. They can still use pen and paper. You can't tell a doctor what hours to be open. You can't do anything. Yet they say they have a healthcare system. But when you look at the incidence of health, of bad health, and you look at where the doctor's offices are located, they're opposite in Toronto. Okay? The areas most acute in healthcare are Rexdale and North Scarborough. There are no doctor's offices in Rexdale and I won't say no, but per capita, there are less doctor's offices in those communities than downtown in the more affluent communities. So, do we have a healthcare system? Well, if we have a government that cannot change the healthcare system without the agreement, that's why when the LHINs have brought in these new funding models, it's cost the people of Ontario $1.1 billion a year to get the doctors to buy into this. So now you're being paid capitation plus some fee-for-service, where before it was all fee-for-service. Doctors didn't want to leave fee-for-service, well, at least that's what they said. Okay, the government says, okay, we'll make your capitation payments $1.1 billion more into the pot than you currently have. Okay, we like that. So, you know, funding in healthcare went up $1.1 billion just to change the way doctors are paid. I mean, there's no system here, right? And I think in social work, we gotta poke holes in these things, because so much of what is told to us is absolute nonsense. I said earlier, we're in a reform agenda in Ontario. It's a reform agenda that has failed everywhere else, but we're doing it here. Why? Well, because the doctors like it, the senior bureaucrats gain more power, and the government looks like it's doing something. Everybody's happy, except no one is getting care. I mean, I don't want to rag on bureaucrats, but the Ministry of Health in Ontario has 6 times more staff than the equivalent ministry for the entire state of Germany, 4 times more than Britain. We have a huge bureaucracy, and that's what Kathleen did win. She brought in more bureaucracy. If we manage the system better, we'll get better results. No, right? Because you can't manage the doctors. So whatever you have with the doctors, it's going to be a voluntary agreement. So you can't. So you come after the people like me, social workers, whatever, who you can actually manage, right? But the doctors, you can't, unless you get the OMA to agree, and they don't agree on anything unless you give them money. So we don't have a system, but we have a system where the bureaucrats have control, and where the OMA is happy and the government looks like it's doing something. That's what we have. And in fact, in the healthcare system, what do we have? You get support for doctors' bills, you get support for hospital stays. That's what we get in our healthcare system. Those are the only 2 things. 33% of what Canadians spend on health comes out of their own pockets. Glasses, dental, drugs, other services, social work, chiropody, whatever, right? The only thing the public system funds are doctors and hospitals. So we don't really have a healthcare system, in my opinion, yet when they throw that out, we have to build a system. Well, you're never going to build a system unless you actually have some control over doctors, in my opinion, because they're the ones that people actually see. You know, they're the gateway to the system. And everything else is just tinkering around the edges. But that's the way it is. And I think as social workers, we got to expose this kind of stuff. I mean, and when you look at COVID, for example, and you look at who didn't get served during COVID, who didn't get vaccinated, who got COVID, it's the Black community and it's the First Nations community, right? So, and that's not just true for COVID. You can look at diabetes, you can look at heart, you can look at any disease you want. And Indigenous and Black populations are going to be at the top of people contracting those diseases. So if we know, and we know this, right? So if we know that race has an impact on one's health, and we as a government choose not to address it, but to do these other things like accountability measures or whatever. So if we know race is the issue and we choose not to do it, aren't we being abundantly racism? Isn't our healthcare system fundamentally racist if we allow this to continue? I think it is. I think if we know Black and Indigenous people are more likely to die sooner than me or you, I think we should do something about that. And I think it was on the other way around. If white people were living less or getting more COVID or whatever, something would have been done. I mean, look at the water in First Nations reserves. It's gone on for years, contaminated water. Like, I really don't think, and Jagmeet Singh said this, if this were white people, this wouldn't go on. And he said, yeah, and then the reporter said to him, well, how much is this going to cost? And he said, I don't care how much it's going to cost. It has to be done. And so anyways, so yeah, we have a racist healthcare system. That's how I start my lectures at York University with that statement, because it's true. It's absolutely true. And I think as social workers, we got an obligation here. We got an obligation here, and it's not just about working within a dysfunctional system, providing comfort to people. It is also about identifying these issues, because why have they never been identified before, really? It's not like the bureaucrats and the government don't know these things. They know them. It's well documented. If you go through the literature, race and health, and it's very well documented, and yet nothing happens, right? There's a job for a social worker. There's a job for an army of social workers, right? So we can't just sit there. We have to be politicized. And if you're not a politicized social worker, in my opinion, you're not doing your job. Now, others will disagree, I'm sure.